Hello, and thanks for stopping by. In my last video, which I'll link below in case you missed it, we examined the history of two bizarre London railway terminals that were established in the 19th century for the purpose of conducting funerals. Although the idea of trains ferrying the dead is indeed a fascinating topic, it is, let's be honest, pretty macabre too. I thought it'd be a fun idea then to cheer things up on the channel by looking at what I consider to be the 20 wackiest railways associated with London. I'll be presenting this parade of oddities over the next 2 videos, counting down in the order I find them to be the most peculiar. Believe me, some of the stuff you're going to see here is truly bonkers. These choices, and the order in which I've assigned them, are of course my own personal opinion, so I'd love to hear your own thoughts in the comments. Anyway, without any further ado, let's begin the first half by counting down from 20 to 11. Number 20. Pubs on wheels. Food and drink have been available on long-distance trains in Britain for many years, whether it be via a buffet car, a trolley service or a small onboard shop. However, in 1949, British Railways decided to take things to the next level by designing a travelling tavern. These mobile pubs were designed to serve commuters as they headed home from the office after a hard day's work. The first pub car was displayed at Waterloo Station in 1949. 8 carriages were rolled out, all of which were christened with traditional pub names. These were the White Horse, the Jolly Tar, the Dolphin, the Three Plovers, the Bull, the Salutation, the Green Man and the Crown. Outside, the carriages were decorated with an unusual livery, the top half being cream and the bottom section made to resemble brickwork. The car's colourful pub sign was also displayed in a side panel. Inside, the carriages were mocked up to look just like a traditional country tavern, complete with low beams, rough whitewashed walls, and of course a bar. It would seem the only thing missing was a cellar. If that wasn't your taste, an accompanying carriage offered a more upmarket service designed to resemble a Soho cocktail lounge. Reception to these balmy bars was mixed. Although the public initially embraced them, they were described, rather scathingly, in Parliament as being shoddy Tudoresque monstrosities. A journalist writing for the Tactile magazine was equally unimpressed, saying that due to the very small windows which were perched high up, the experience could only be appreciated by those few who would enjoy eating in tube trains. It was also claimed the lack of windows made people feel sick and dizzy, nothing at all to do with the booze, I'm sure. The tavern cars didn't last for very long, they were phased out in the 1950s. Personally, I'd love to see them return, although I'd probably end up missing my stop frequently if they were running on today's network. Number 19. The Scrubber. London is served by the world's oldest underground system, the history of which began with the opening of the Metropolitan Railway way back in 1863. These early underground trains were hauled by steam engines. Although modified in an attempt to help them operate in a subterranean environment, the locomotives still produced substantial amounts of choking smoke and soot. So dreadful was the air down there in fact, the company encouraged their drivers to grow beards, suggesting that a big bush of facial hair would act as a filter against the smoke. By the turn of the 20th century, this problem began to ease when the early lines were switched to electricity. However, several decades worth of steam engines ploughing through the system had left the tunnel walls in a filthy state, meaning they're in dire need of a clean-up. To help scrub the grubby brickwork, this special flatbed truck was introduced, which was equipped with an extra long brush. The device was electric, allowing the bristles to spin around and churn up the muck, no doubt leaving the tunnels looking close to brand spanking new. The device is pictured here in the Sphere magazine in September 1905, cleaning the tunnels of the District Railway, which, as I'm sure you can guess, is now known as the District Line. Number 18. Upstairs Downstairs. Although double-deck trains are a common sight in many countries, they've never caught on in the UK, largely due to the 19th century network sticking a load of low bridges and tunnels in the way. How inconsiderate. If you want to experience double-deck travel in Britain, you need to go by bus. Having said that, there was a period when double-decker trains, albeit rather compact ones, did have a go at operating in Britain. Known as the Class 4 DDs, the double D no doubt standing for double-decker, these were commissioned by the Southern Railway Company in the late 1940s. A mock-up version, which, as seen in this photograph, looks rather like an oversized child's playhouse, was shown off to the public at Marylebone Station in February 1949. The double-deckers entered service in the autumn of that same year, running between Charing Cross and Dartford. 2 units, each made up of 8 cars, were built. With the extra bit on top, these unusual trains managed to shoehorn in an impressive 1,104 seats. However, as they still had to squeeze through the aforementioned Victorian infrastructure, their design was a lot tighter than examples you'd see on the continent. This meant the upper level was notoriously cramped. I mean, just look at this guy. And the claustrophobia was made worse by the fact that the windows on the higher level were not designed to open, this being due to the narrow clearance required for tunnels. Although cooling fans and strip lights were incorporated into the design, these carriages gained something of a reputation for being stuffy sweatboxes. Despite the drawbacks, the 2 units managed to remain in service on the Charing Cross to Dartford route throughout the 1950s and 60s before being withdrawn in October 1971. 2 of the cars survive today, held by preservation groups in Kent and Northamptonshire. Number 17. All aboard for Pickle Herring Stairs. In April 1870, a short tunnel opened beneath the River Thames which briefly provided the route for what was essentially the world's first deep level railway line. It was known as the Tower Subway. The short narrow pipeline linked Tower Hill on the northern bank of the Thames, just beside the Tower of London, to a spot on the southern side known as Pickle Herring Stairs, which today is covered by Vine Lane just off of Tooley Street. A narrow gauge track was laid in the tunnel, along which a single carriage was hauled by a wire cable, which in turn was powered by a stationary 4-horsepower steam engine, which chugged away on the southern end. The lone carriage, which had a door at each end, was described in the Times as being something between a railway carriage and the better kind of omnibus. It could hold up to 14 passengers who'd squeeze in for the 3-minute ride. First and second class tickets were available, costing 2p and 1p respectively, although first class merely granted the upper crust punters priority boarding, a bit like a budget airline. Sadly, the Tower Subway quickly proved economically unviable, and it closed within just a year. The tunnel was then converted into a pedestrian subway, which itself closed in 1898, mainly due to competition from the recently opened Tower Bridge. Looking at the 2 options, you can't really blame people for taking the above ground route. After all, the subway was cramped, damp, and it had an air of menace about it. Not helped by the fact that, in the autumn of 1888, at the height of the Jack the Ripper killings, an unhinged man was spotted down there, brandishing a knife. Since its closure to the public, the tunnel has been used to carry various facilities. This small brick rotunda, which sits quietly by on Petty Wales, just across from the Tower of London, marks the old entrance to the subway. Number 16. Toy trains and padded cells. In 1890, 20 years after the Tower Subway's brief sojourn, the first major tube railway, that is, the first deep level underground line to be powered by electricity and to run along a relatively long line, began operating. This was the City and South London Railway, which initially served 6 stations: Stockwell, Oval, Kennington, Elephant and Castle, Borough, and King William Street. Today this route has been incorporated into the Northern Line, apart from King William Street, which didn't last very long, closing in 1900 due to its awkward layout. As the City and South London Line was such a pioneering railway, its engineers were of course in completely new territory. This meant the first trains used on it looked kinda kooky compared to the ones Londoners have since become accustomed to. With a top speed of 25 miles per hour, these electric locomotives were very basic, and looking at them today, it's fair to assume that operating one must have been a rather noisy and bone-shaking experience for the hardy drivers. Stranger still were the carriages in which the passengers were conveyed. You see, because the City and South London Railway ran completely underground in dark, narrow tunnels, early designers figured there was nothing interesting to see, and so the windows in the carriages were tiny, relegated to nothing more than thin strips of glass positioned up near the ceiling. As there was barely any window space, the majority of the carriage walls therefore were taken up by tall, springy seats, a design which quickly led to the cars being given the rather creepy nickname, padded cells. Travelling in one of these carriages as they groaned deep beneath Victorian London must have been a rather unsettling and claustrophobic experience. Number 15. Tube with a View. In complete contrast to the Victorian padded cells was the experimental Vista car, which was trialled on the Bakerloo line between 1949 and 1950. The Vista contained extra glass with windows stretching 3.5 foot around the carriage, the idea being that those commuters forced to stand during busy periods would still be granted a view. Round porthole style windows were also incorporated. Overall, the effect made the tube carriage look rather like a miniature version of those big gleaming observation cars which are used for sightseeing in Canada and USA, only in this case you'd be peering at tube tunnels from smoggy urban landscapes. The Vista doesn't appear to have gained much traction. It's only a guess, but I reckon the main reason for this is that a substantial amount of advertising space would have been lost had the design been adopted. There appears to be very little information out there about the Vista carriage. If you know anything more about it, please do let me know in the comments, as I'll be fascinated to find out more. Number 14. Army Puffers. For several centuries, Woolwich in southeast London was home to the mighty Royal Arsenal, a military complex which evolved to embody munitions factories, stores, a dockyard, a military academy, and even firing ranges. At its height, the arsenal was essentially a walled-off town spanning 1,285 acres, within a strip of land measuring 3 miles long by 1 mile wide. By the First World War, it employed over 70,000 workers. This vast area was vital for the smooth running of Britain's armed forces, and to keep it ticking over, it relied upon its own private railway. This internal system began to develop in the 19th century, gradually transforming into a spaghetti-like network encompassing 140 miles of track. Not surprisingly, this made it one of the most complex and densely packed railway systems in the whole of Britain. The rolling stock used on the Royal Arsenal Railway included a mixture of different gauged steam locomotives and all manner of wagons for carting around the Arsenal's explosive freight. There were trains for carrying workers too, and even here this included segregated classes. In some instances, the third-class carriages appeared to be little more than benches on wheels, although they looked like great fun to ride. In later years, the system also used dinky diesel engines. The Royal Arsenal Railway remained in use until 1966, and the complex closed for good in 1994. Number 13. Special Delivery. The Metropolitan, the Northern, Bakerloo, Circle, Central, the London Underground's lines are household names. Many people though have no idea that another tube line used to run beneath the capital streets. You can't blame them for not knowing, as this line was completely closed off to the public, and it certainly didn't appear on any map. The line in question was the London Post Office Railway, which, for 76 years, whisked countless heaps of letters and parcels beneath the city streets. At its height, the system carried an average of 4 million items over the course of every 22-hour working day. The Deep Line opened in 1927 and sped between Whitechapel in the east and Paddington in the west. Along this 6.5 mile or 10.5 kilometre route, there were 9 stations, all of which were located deep within the bowels of London's major post office depots. These were Whitechapel, Liverpool Street, King Edward Street, Mount Pleasant, New Oxford Street, Rathbone Place, Wimpole Street, Bird Street and Paddington. The line was powered by electricity, and all of the little wagons which ran on it were driverless. Quite something, considering it started operating in the 1920s, many decades before the Docklands Light Railway began running automated trains. Sadly, the Post Office Railway was closed in 2003, which seems a bit daft to be honest, considering how atrocious traffic above ground has become. The tunnels still lurk down there, mothballed and silent. There is one small section though that is being reinstated as part of the Postal Museum at Mount Pleasant. Here you can see the depot and, even more excitingly, take a short ride through the tunnel in a specially built passenger car. It's well worth a visit. If you'd like to know more, I'll leave a link in the description. Number 12. Colonial Circle Line. Between May and October 1911, the huge Crystal Palace leisure complex, which sprawled between Penge and Sydenham, hosted the rather bombastic Festival of Empire, which was put on to celebrate the recent coronation of King George V. This saw what can only be described as a British Empire theme park being built within the grounds of the palace, in which, quote, representations of possessions beyond the seas were presented to visitors. This included mock-ups of an Indian tea plantation, a South African gold mine, and an Australian vineyard. Reconstructions of various governmental buildings from Australia, Canada, Newfoundland, New Zealand and South Africa were also on show. To help visitors soak up the pomp, a special electric railway was built which looped around the exhibits. This was named the All Red Route, and it contained stations where people could hop on and off at points around the mini empire. The railway even incorporated a tunnel and a long cutting. The trains which ran on the line resembled open-sided streetcars. They were painted red and gold and had bench-like seats capable of accommodating 39 passengers. Following the exhibition, one of the motorcars, along with its trailer, was sold to the Dublin and Lucan Tramway in Ireland, where they remained in service until the 1920s. Number 11. Back in Time for Tea. Despite being a rather unassuming station, South Acton has a long history dating back to 1880. Today you'll find it on the London Overground, but there was a period when it was an outpost of the District Line. During this era, which lasted from 1905, under the original District Railway, to 1959, South Acton Station lay on a short, stubby branch line which was tethered to Acton Town Station. This track between South Acton and Acton Town was less than a mile long and has since been demolished, although you can still see an echo of it on Bollow Lane, where the remains of an old bridge still stand. Because demand for this wee line was very low, it was operated by a simple shuttle service which trundled back and forth between the two stations. This was provided by a solitary London Underground carriage, which locals nicknamed the Penny Jinny, or sometimes just the Jinny, which appears to be a corruption of Little Jenny, named after an older steam service which used to operate on the same line. The staff who worked the service had another nickname though. They called it the Tea Run. This was because it was possible for a driver to boil a kettle of water in the time it took to run the lone carriage back and forth between the two stations. Once a circuit between Acton Town and South Acton had been complete, the driver could then pop back into the staff room where the water would be just about ready to make a nice cup of tea. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the first part of this countdown looking at London's weirdest railways. I'd be interested to hear what you think of the first 10 on this list. Would you have braved the Tower subway? Or do you think Vista cars and double-deckers should be given a second chance? Be sure to stick around for the second instalment, in which we'll be looking at the top 10 quirky trains. The number 1 slot I've chosen really does need to be seen to be believed. Sincere thanks to all of you who've subscribed recently. If you haven't yet already, I'd really appreciate it if you could please consider doing so, as your support will help the channel grow, whilst also ensuring that you don't miss out on any future content. likes and shares are also very much appreciated. In the meantime, if you'd like to discover more London-based content, head on over to my website, robinslondon.com, where you'll find more history, stories and trivia. If trains are your thing, there's even a series of tube quizzes to try out there. Links in the description. For now, thanks again, stay well and stay tuned.